You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We're back in the studio. It's been a minute on our end. It feels like forever, and so I'm trying to remember I'm trying to remember how we ended the show. I know where we ended, but I don't remember exactly what we discussed. But hopefully you do, because it was just last week for you guys. And but we're picking up in chapter 3 with the call of Samuel.
Yeah. So Eli, in the last chapter, Eli's house has been rejected.
Yeah.
And his offspring are not going to have long lives. And that's going to become important here in a few chapters. This book, it jumps everywhere. Mm-hmm. And there's so many ties, and trying to keep it all together, my brain was on overload as I was doing notes for this, because there's so many points. I feel like that meme with the guy with the strings. Yeah.
Well, and the conspiracy theorist guy. Yeah. So we're not cracking into any of those, but this is actually, one of the complaints about the Bible is that the timeline doesn't work. But of course, ancient historians didn't. Well, they weren't even thinking of themselves as historians for one. They were just putting stories together and trying to tell the whole story. But it's one of those things. This is where we actually kind of jump back in the timeline, and it's a really easy one to see, and it's an obvious one that's there for an obvious reason, because we're kind of trying to tell two stories concurrently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We got two main characters.
We're jumping off of Eli as the main character and on to Samuel. So we've kind of completed Eli's story,
that section of it, and he'll
still be a recurring character
for a little while.
For a little bit. But to get to the beginning of Samuel's story, you have to go back in Eli's story a little bit. And that's pretty easy to see in the text. But I just wanted to, while it's an easy one to look at, kind of point that out for, to show that this happens a lot, and probably often more times than we realize.
And in Samuel, it's just so obvious, because he even does some deliberate flashback scenes, the writers do, and you're just kind of going, okay, wait a minute, this happened, but then that happened. And so trying to make a cohesive timeline. And then if you try to bring in Chronicles, which is telling some of the same stories when we get to David, and then you want to get into the prophets that are addressing the issues going on during the king's times, then now you've got all of these threads to hold together.
And that's what we're here to do, right?
Yeah. Oh, and let's not forget that every story that's gone before, you were going to have different points of reference to them, particularly Genesis and Exodus. Mm-hmm. So, it's, not too big of a deal to hold it all together. But so Samuel is older than, a child now. Some years have passed. He's not a 4-year-old or a 2-year-old at this point. He's old enough to be entrusted with certain duties around the temple. And so, 7, 8, 9, we don't know. The timeline is obscure. So we're operating under the guidance of Eli. So he's still needing some direction. He's not ready to go out on his own yet.
Right.
So we're told in verse 1 that the word of the Lord was rare, and in those days there was no frequent vision. And we know that this is accurate because we're still in the time of the Judges. Mm-hmm. Remember, those two books overlap. And God is only speaking to a very select few individuals for specific purposes. Mm-hmm. So, when he's talking to Gideon or he's talking to Samson, it's because he's got a job for them to do. It is not a nationwide prophecy that's being delivered.
Right. So
the word of the Lord was rare. That phrase, when we find something like that, or God's not speaking, this is a matter of judgment. Mm-hmm. There's something going on that God's not happy about. So we find that in Psalm 74:9. There was no longer any prophet.
Yeah. It's kind of funny, because I think of people who think that they don't necessarily want God to speak because they're afraid of what he'll say. Mm-hmm. And where this is kind of like, it's like when you're in a when there's an issue with in your marriage or relationship, and
we need to talk.
We need to talk. Yeah. And but whenever there's the silence, you're like, is it worse?
Well, and that's kind of what's going on here. What's happening? And do the people want the vision? Mm-hmm. Because we're going to have a contrast that comes up where we see the people, they want the vision. They want God to speak. Mm-hmm. But here, there's no cry for it. But there hasn't been a cry for it. Go back to Samson. Mm-hmm. There was no cry for a prophet or God to show up at Samson's time, and God chooses to move. The same thing. Remember, we made those connections from Samson and Samuel earlier on. This is another thing that connects them. So we should be prepared for this.
Right.
So, Psalm 74:9 talks about no longer being a prophet. Lamentations 2:9, prophets found no vision. Amos 8:11, the people who will thirst to hear the Lord. So when God is being silent, it's with the intention of making people want to hear him.
Right.
It's not silent just because he's mad at them. I mean, he might be mad at them, but he wants the communication to be restored, but they have to approach him with the right heart. Mm-hmm. So,
well, it's like I've told you the solution. Mm-hmm. Now let's see how long this plays out. And whenever you get tired of not having any help, come see me.
Well, and that's the theme of Samuel. You've got the solution. You know what to do. It was the theme of Judges. Mm-hmm. And really, if you want to be, current, it's the theme of our lives.
Right.
We've got the solution. If you want me to move, do what you were told. No frequent vision is an interesting phrase because the word there is katzon. It's the same word that we find in Proverbs 29:18, where there is no katzon, the people cast off restraint. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a prophetic vision, and it always has something to do with prophecy. So even though you kind of miss it in the Proverbs, we have all these other uses for it that demonstrate that. Mm-hmm. And Amos 1:1, Micah 1:1, and Isaiah 2:1, that's the verbal form of that, and it's found in the phrase, the words of the prophet concerning what he saw. Mm-hmm. So there's that connection. But then in Isaiah 30:10, I thought this was an interesting verse. The word katzon's there, but it's got a lamed, or what we would call the letter L, attached to it.
Okay.
And when you attach that, it becomes a title for prophets. And so it always has that connection. So Isaiah 30:10 says, who say to the seer, do not see, and to the prophets, lakson, do not prophesy. To us, what is right. Speak to us smooth things and prophesy illusions. So it's true vision. It's someone who has the ability to see into the spirit realm, which again, this is a ongoing theme in Samuel.
Right.
So Lamentations 2:14, I know I'm spending some time on this word because this is an important word in Samuel, but it's translated visions or oracles. And the English version, the ESV, has visions and oracles as two separate words. Both times in the Hebrew, that word is katzon, but English translators are afraid of repetition. And they think that if you don't change the vocabulary up and use synonyms, then the writing's not going to be as interesting.
Right.
And so they kind of subvert the Hebrew idea of if you repeat something,
then it's important.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I want to get a hold of Robert Alter's translation, because he retains all those repetitions from everything I've heard from him and read. So that's on my list of things, that I need for the podcast, not for myself.
So if anybody wants to send that, send us a message.
So this idea of seeing into the spirit realm isn't just relegated to Israelites' prophets. It actually extends to other prophets to foreign lands. And so we have it used 4 times of unnamed prophets, that lakason, where it becomes a title for a prophet. We have it 8 times used for a named prophet. 3 times it's used of the temple singers, which I thought was very interesting.
That's very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, well, you've got to remember in the ancient world, and if you're in the paddle store, you've got a copy of my thesis, where it talks about artists, whether it's musical or visual, they share a role in the Hebrew culture of being prophetic. And so I'm not going to take time to go on that today, but...
Yeah, well, that's for a future podcast. We'll get to that.
So basically the point is there's a supernatural meaning to this word, and it always talks about going into the spirit realm, seeing into the spirit realm, and revealing what's going on in the spirit realm to humanity.
Okay.
So basically what's going on, nobody knows what the game plan is.
Right.
If you're Israel, you've been operating under the premise that you have supernatural guidance and vision, and God is speaking to you about what's happening behind the scenes through the prophets. And if you don't have that, then what do you do?
Right. Well, and so the assumption, of course, being that you have that, but here the writer of Samuel is saying, no, you didn't have the guidance that you thought you did.
Yeah, yeah. And this is, this idea that prophecy is important is really huge in Samuel. And it's why in the Jewish Bible, Samuel is included in the Nevi'im, the prophetic books, because everything that happens in Samuel is going to be initiated by a prophetic word, where we don't have that through Judges.
Right.
And so Judges really provides that great contrast. And if you haven't listened to our series on Judges, you probably want to go ahead and do that, because there's going to be some things that we're going to be talking about that won't make a lot of sense going forward unless you have that background. So, verse 2. At that time, Eli, whose eyes had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. So Eli, he's almost always going to have some reference to vision, that he doesn't have it. So if the leader of Shiloh doesn't have a vision, then why would we expect the country to?
Right.
Because he's a representation of the country as a whole. So verse 3, I'm going to go on. The lamp of God had not gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. So this is probably one of the more famous stories. We've got Samuel. He's in the temple. Eli's in his bed. Go ahead.
Now, I have a question. I'm not sure if you're going to get to this, but it says the lamp of God had not gone out. Now, is that a reference to just kind of what time of day it is? Because I do know that there are certain times that you light candles and you're not supposed to extinguish them. They are supposed to go out on their own.
Right. In the temple, there was a light that was lit, or I don't know if it was one or more, but there were lights that were in the temple that were supposed to burn all night long. And there was somebody there who was charged with watching them and making sure that, nothing set on fire, that they were not extinguished, and they didn't go out until sunrise.
Okay, so that means it's in the middle of the night.
Precisely. So he's in the temple taking care of this. So this kind of gives you an idea of an age that we would, what age would you trust a child to watch over candles unattended by anyone else?
Well, I think in the ancient world, probably a little earlier, because they were a little more common.
2.
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I guess, things being lost in big fires used to be more common too, but...
Yeah. And there's tapestries all around.
Right.
So, we aren't asking for any trouble, but I actually saw something about churches who do have candle lightings during their services. They usually give the candle lighter to the youngest person in the congregation. What could go wrong with that? It'd be interesting to see if that has any ties back to Samuel because of this. That's liturgical, and I'm not familiar with that world as much. But anyway, just if anybody knows, let me know. So, but notice what it doesn't say. It does not say he's asleep. He's not asleep. Everybody wants to assume that he is asleep. You do not sleep in the temple. Now, he was lying down. You shouldn't lie down in the temple. As a matter of fact, you aren't even supposed to sit down in the temple. But, I mean, nobody's really doing completely the right thing. They're just kind of doing sort of the right thing at this point in time. And that verse about tending the lamps in the temple is in Exodus 27. That's verse 20 and 21. And I actually marked that one because I don't think a lot of us are familiar with this idea. So it says, Exodus 27, verses 20 and 21, "You shall command the people of Israel that they bring to you pure beaten olive oil for the light, that the lamp may regularly be set up to burn. In the tent of the meeting, outside the veil, is before the testimony. Aaron and his sons shall tend to it in the evening to morning, before the Lord. It shall be a statute forever to be observed throughout the generations by the people of Israel." So this is one of the priestly duties, and the fact that Samuel is doing it also confirms that Samuel is from the tribe of Levi. He's one of the sons of Aaron. He is not just a random person.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, okay. So it's, he's old enough to be performing a priestly task.
Yeah. Yeah. But again, everything's still kind of wishy-washy at this point, because Hophni and Phinehas, they're the main priest at this point. Eli's retired. He's just kind of retaining that honored position. And they aren't doing correctly. So it may be one of those things where Eli's just having to get help where he can get help. And so if Samuel's a little young, so be it.
Yeah, and apparently his boys, if it doesn't involve meat or women.
Sex, yeah, they really aren't interested. So that's going to come up later too in the rest of the story. But we all know the story. Samuel, he hears the voice, and Samuel replies, "Hanani, here I am. I'm ready to do whatever needs to be done. I'm committing to it before I even know the circumstances or conditions." Mm-hmm. But now he's saying this to Eli. And Eli tells him, "Go back, lie down. It wasn't me." And so this happens a couple of times. And I think it's very interesting in verse 7. It's specifically the text notes that Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And so it's kind of offered as an explanation. This is why Samuel doesn't know God's voice. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a sad commentary.
Yeah, I mean, because wouldn't you assume that he would have been taught Torah? Mm-hmm.
He's growing up in the temple. He's growing up with the spiritual leaders of Israel. And why doesn't he know this? And he's obviously old enough to be trusted with these priestly duties. So at this point, he should have known, because the basic principle is that you begin teaching a child Torah as soon as they're able to speak. Mm-hmm. And so around 3 years old is kind of the rule of thumb. And you begin with Leviticus. And that just cracks me up. I can't imagine trying to teach a child to memorize Leviticus, because we got people who won't even read it in their 40s. So, I mean, but contrast that with Naomi and Ruth, because, Ruth is in Moab with this Israelite woman who's having all this hardship, and she knows more about God at this point, is wanting to draw near to God, just based on her experience with Naomi. And so the distinction, we're constantly seeing these women who are presenting the Torah better than the men. And we had that with Mrs. Manoach, who seemed to have way more understanding. We have it with Naomi. Now we're seeing how the men are falling down on their job here in Samuel. Mm-hmm. And we're actually going to have another woman speak up. I mean, Hannah, obviously, she spoke up at the beginning of the book, but another woman's going to speak up in chapter 4. So she's going to show that she has a better understanding. So the third time that God calls to Samuel, Eli finally gets a clue. Right. Because evidently Eli's not with it very much either. I don't know if he thinks the boy's dreaming or what. Or maybe it's just because God hadn't spoken in so long, it doesn't even occur to Eli that God could be speaking again. And it shows us how unaware Eli is of events, just over and over again. So, verse 10, "And the Lord came and stood, calling as other times, 'Samuel, Samuel.' And Samuel said, 'Speak, for your servant hears.'" So, notice the language there. God came and stood. So this presents him. He's not just an audible voice. He's there. He's present. This is the same language that we have back with Gideon whenever the angel of the Lord appeared to him. "Samuel, Samuel." That's the formulaic announcement that God's the one who's talking. We have that Abraham, Jacob, Saul, with before Paul and Saul in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons why Saul knew that it was God talking to him on the Damascus Road, and not, just he bumped his head too hard.
That's interesting. Yeah. I do find it, I find it funny that it does say God came and stood at the temple. Mm-hmm. Because again, we do have that idea that it's just this disembodied voice. And I've actually been told that he just heard a voice, and it's,
I think that's how it was taught to me, but yet here in the scripture, it plainly says something different. Mm-hmm. And I think it shows us how often our presuppositions really become an issue with what we can grasp from the scripture.
Yeah. Well, and I guess there's not like the SBC footnote that this is obviously anthropomorphism,
Well, and we were talking, I was talking to somebody online just yesterday when we went through Judges 1 and 2, where they're having conversations with God before they go into Canaan. And the angel of the Lord in chapter 2 shows up and says, "I'm going to leave you." Mm-hmm. And the people see him, and you realize, wait a minute, he's been there with them the entire time, having these conversations, fighting with them in these battles. he wasn't some abstract idea. He wasn't just that pillar of smoke and fire. He was a person living among them, or at least showing up when they needed him.
Right.
And
which that kind of blows my mind. And I made the joke about the SBC. I'm not trying to just make fun of Baptists. That's just how we were raised SBC.
We're making fun of ourselves and our own heritage. Yeah. Yeah. So, but the gentleman I was talking with, he pointed out the language about Jericho and how God was actually marching with them. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing I hadn't put together. So we have it over and over again in the Old Testament. We've just been blinded to it because we're following tradition instead of actually reading what's on the page. So and that's one of the reasons why I love doing this, because I have to actually stop and look at what's on the page.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things. A lot of scholars get criticized when they present stuff like this because they're bringing some kind of new teaching. It's some kind of or like, why didn't anybody? If this was really what God's word said, then it wouldn't have been such a secret for so long. He's like, it's not a secret.
It's not.
It's carefully concealed in books.
Yes. I caught the Lake Placid reference there. So anyway, this is true. And I have a whole tangent on that, so I'll restrain myself. So verse 11, then the Lord said to Samuel, behold, I'm about to do a new thing in Israel at which the two ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. And so, I'm going to make your ears burn pretty much. A new thing, all new things begin with the Lord. I don't care where you are in the Bible. I don't care where you are in history. All new things begin with the Lord. The ears will tingle. We find this 3 times in the scripture. One is here, obviously. The second time is in 2 Kings 21:12, and we know Kings is a continuation of Samuel, so it makes sense that they use the phrase again. But it's God speaking once again, and he's denouncing Manasseh. And Manasseh is not a great king, and when we get to him, a lot of the things that we've said in previous episodes, I think, are going to make a lot more sense.
Okay,
and
yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, well, and the warning that God is giving is that Solomon's temple is going to be destroyed. And so we know that there's a connection with the destruction of the temple and this phrase, because we also find it in Jeremiah 19:3, also prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem. So God's holy place is being destroyed. They make people's ears burn when they hear the news. Matter of fact, they can't even accept it. They can't believe that this is something that God is going to do.
Right.
And this is a clue as to the fate of Shiloh.
Well, and I think it's really interesting that God says he's going to destroy the temple or allow the temple to be destroyed. What other God is going to do that in ancient cultures?
None, because they couldn't afford to.
Yeah.
I mean, their reputation would be completely ruined. Their place of power and authority would be decimated, and then they would no longer have power and authority. God doesn't need a temple.
Right.
And that's amazing news. And I think if you were an ancient person hearing that and realizing that just tells you the God of Israel is so much bigger than any other God you're going to encounter.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
And this is why we study this stuff, because it makes everything more interesting. And I mean, it doesn't, it just reveals how interesting it is. It doesn't make anything more interesting. But so we'll talk probably more about that when we get there. Yeah,
well, because we got some great things to say about temples of other gods coming up in a future episode. But this is really a clue that Shiloh is going to be destroyed after the battle with the Philistines, and that's coming up soon too. And we never have it mentioned as a place of worship after this point in time. So even though the text never specifically says that Shiloh is destroyed, and we just kind of have to gather from other sources and the lack of things that are said about it and try to understand what's not being said. And that's the reason why you have to be familiar with your Bible, because sometimes important things aren't always said. They're not said, and you're supposed to notice that they're not said.
Right.
So verses 12 through 14, God basically promises to fulfill his words to Eli. He told Eli in chapter 2, hey, I'm going to cut off your house. I'm going to judge your house. There's going to be problems. And it's reminding Eli that he had a chance to act. he could have restrained his sons, but he didn't. And because he didn't restrain his sons, God's going to take him out.
Mm-hmm.
And God's telling Eli that at this point, it doesn't even matter how much you sacrifice, how much you cry. I'm not going to forgive, and I'm not going to relent. It's too late. You had your chance. And, this is God maintaining healthy boundaries. This is not him being unfeeling or unkind, because Eli knew what should have been happening.
Mm-hmm.
Eli had heard from the people the horrible things his sons were doing. He didn't act. God himself sends a prophet, an unnamed, an Ish Elohim, unnamed prophet, says, this is what's happening. You need to do something about it. So he's had several chances to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he has decided not to act, other than, this kind of little slap on the wrist thing that he had with his sons in chapter 2 that really didn't amount to anything. He could have prevented Shiloh from being destroyed, and he possibly could have even saved his entire house and let them maintain that role in the temple. But as it is, they're going to wind up begging for bread. They're going to try any way they can to get back into priestly service so that they can have some substance.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have that. So one of the things this is telling us is God doesn't play favorites. He doesn't care what your role is. He doesn't care what your title is. If you're messing up, there's consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if you're his priest and you're making these kinds of decisions and being inactive like this, you are actually probably bringing more problems on yourself than if you're just a lay person who's misbehaving. And
right. Yep.
I think leadership is held more accountable.
No, I mean we're told that, we're told that in the New Testament, I believe. I think Paul writes that to somebody.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up, but I think the principle's there. So maybe I'll remember to put it in the show notes. I'm not promising anything. So anyway, verse 15, Samuel lay until morning, and then he opened the doors to the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell his vision to Eli. Now, this is good prophetic practice. And I have a lot of people on Facebook that I see who call themselves prophets, and I've seen, clips of different people who call themselves prophets. I'm not debating whether or not they are, but I think these are good kind of litmus tests to kind of put out there if you come across some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Don't start running your mouth just because you think you've heard from the Lord.
Well, there's that.
Take a beat.
Yeah. Well, and just find that person to speak some wisdom into things, but also because also get it on record with somebody before an event happens. Because there's the other side of that where I've seen some prophets who, this event happened. Yeah. And the Lord told me about it 6 months ago. And, let's go post-date the prophecy.
Yeah. Well, that's it. And if that did happen, like I said, I'm not debating whether or not it did happen. It wasn't prophecy. It was a mystical experience. And there's a difference. Mystical experiences are private for individual edification. Prophetic experiences are public. And they're not complete until they have an audience to engage in them. Again, that's all in my thesis in the paddle store. So I'm making a plug here. Become a Patreon supporter. But I think that a lot of times there's this prophetic urgency. And this is kind of throughout the Bible that when you hear from God, there's this tendency to want to run out and proclaim it. But Samuel, and we also see this with Jeremiah, they pause, they sleep on it, they take some time because the word is so big. And you got to, this is basically Samuel's dad. And he's been functioning in that father figure kind of role. And he's going to go tell him this horrible news. And he recognizes the impact that it's going to make on Eli's life. I mean, Hophni and Phinehas were, either like brothers or cousins or, uncles maybe.
Mm-hmm.
They were important figures in Samuel's life too. And they would have been eating at the same meals together. They would have been, working alongside each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so this isn't something that Samuel's just, oh, good, I get to go tell the bad guys that God's going to destroy them. He feels the pain that this is going to cause.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the second thing we need to look at when we're talking about prophetic words. Do you feel the pain that the word is going to cause? Because if you're just going to gloat because you get to tell someone they're screwing up, I mean, that's not a prophetic word. We do that every day. Read Facebook.
Right.
And so, I mean, and that's the thing with God's prophets. When the people are in sin, is there anger? Yes. But that anger always is the secondary emotion that covers a broken heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're gonna talk some more about this. Now, the word for vision in this section is mare. Gotta get all my vowel pointing in there.
Yeah.
So it's used mostly in Ezekiel and Daniel, and it literally means glass. It's can be glass. It can be that the polished bronze surfaces that were used as mirrors. It's anything that has the ability to produce a reflection.
Okay.
And we first find this word in Genesis 46:2, and it's when Jacob is going down to Egypt to see Joseph, and it's the last time that God speaks. Mm-hmm. So we have that connection back to Egypt. Exodus 38:8 is the second time we see it, and that's whenever the bronze lavers for the tabernacle are made, and they're mm-hmm. made with the bronze looking glasses of the women who are serving in the temple. So again, we've got kind of this very subtle connection back with the temple or the tabernacle mm-hmm. and the women who were serving, but it's all tied up with the vision language.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't make too big of a point on it, but I find it interesting that the writer is using these little subtleties to keep our minds focused on the point he's trying to make. Mm-hmm. And that's the mark of a good writer.
Yeah.
So Numbers 12:6 also, this is where God reminds the people that he speaks through prophets and through visions and dreams, but not to Moses. He's faithful in all my house, mouth to mouth, and beholds the form of the Lord. I'm trying to think why I kept that. Oh, yes, he doesn't speak to God through Moses through that glass dimly.
Oh, gotcha.
And so, yeah, it's been a few days since I've actually wrote these.
Yeah. You got several weeks of research here, and you're going back to the beginning.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And I read through them last night, but and like I said, there's so many threads. There's just so many threads that you got to hold together. And Samuel is going to have this vision, but at the same time, remember, 9 times in the book of Samuel, we're told that Samuel serves before the Lord. And we're mm-hmm. reminded that he talks to God like Moses talks to God face to face, because Samuel is playing the Moses character in this role, mm-hmm. In this book.
And you're talking about all the references. Is it a lot of the references to the tabernacle and to what's going on to remind us that this isn't just a story about Samuel, it's a story about the entire nation and
yeah.
and how God relates to them?
Oh, yeah. Because as we go through Samuel, this is a point of transition, and we're going from that time of the judges, and we're going to a monarchy, and there's a whole new politics to work out, and there's new forms mm-hmm. of relationship for the nation to try to figure out. And so here in Samuel, we're still in that period of judges, and Samuel is the last judge. And so we're being reminded of the judges' function and how they play a role in the formation of Israel. And it's kind of being hammered home really hard, because what's going to happen is we need that foundation to make that contrast when the king arrives. Mm-hmm. And so this is the reason why the writer keeps pulling us back to the Torah, taking us back to Egypt, taking us back through the Exodus, because that's really where the period of the judges and the prophets' leadership began.
Yeah, and the progress, I mean, the way that everything moves through Israel's history is really weird anyway, because it doesn't start as a monarchy, which I'm sure, I mean, I guess ultimately no civilization really technically starts as a monarchy. I don't know exactly how all that works out, but I mean, you would think that Moses or Moses' successor would fill that role. And it doesn't happen that way. Well, even Moses' successor wasn't his son.
Right.
So it's a really bizarre transition, especially when you look at how quickly everything descends into the Judges period.
Well, but the thing is, if there had been a monarch coming out of Egypt, those E words throw me.
Sure. The Exodus from Egypt.
Yes. And so if there had been a monarch, who's going to get all the credit? It's not going to be God.
Right.
So if you keep a king out of the picture who is either the embodiment of God or the human representative for God, depending on which culture and which time you're talking. But, if you keep him out of the picture, now the people have to accept that God is the one who's doing all this.
Right.
And then if you look back at Genesis, there are so many times where kings are present. I mean, Abraham has dealings with Pharaoh, with Abimelech, the War of the Five Kings, the king of Sodom. I mean, we have all Sodom. Sorry, flicked over into Hebrew. But the establishments of monarchies were very much a part of the world and had been for, at least 300 years before this is happening, if not 6 to 7.
Right.
So...
No, and then whenever he does establish the one who's going to have the lasting monarchy, it's the shepherd. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Oh,
and especially there's that tie back to, and I know we'll probably get there, but there's that tie back to Egypt, because the Israelites were shameful.
An abomination,
because they were sheep herders. And so anyway, that's...
Well,
I'm like I said, I'm probably getting ahead, but we'll hit it again.
Oh, we're going to be jumping back and forth so often. But I mean, that's the thing with this, and I can't overstate this. There are so many connections, and I don't even hit them all. I had to go, we can only handle so much before our brains truly do fry.
Well, the good news is we've got plenty of time to do it.
We got plenty of time. I just don't know if we
set the schedule.
Well, I just don't know if we have the bandwidth. That's the problem. If we go any deeper, I'm going to need a dry erase board, and we're going to have to start drawing charts.
I can get you want a dry erase board? I can get you a dry erase board.
I always want a dry erase board.
We'll just have to figure out how that's going to work with the microphones.
So, okay. We'll have to figure that out later. Verses 16 through 18, Eli calls to Samuel in the morning. He recognizes that Samuel has had this experience with God, and he probably has at least some intuition that it's not been necessarily pleasant. Remembering, we always think of God showing up as being this great and wonderful thing. It was a terrifying thing. When the angel of the Lord appears, almost every time his first words are, "Fear not."
Don't be afraid.
So this is something that I think Eli at least had enough sense to recognize. But he makes Samuel promise to tell him everything that God has said. And he even threatens Samuel with kind of these grave consequences if he hides anything.
Well, I mean, okay, so here's the other thing. Can you imagine this conversation? So first off, you have what God says to Samuel. And in the morning, Eli's like, so what did God say to you? Well, the thing is, if you listen to what God said, I will do to Eli all that I've said, but he doesn't tell Samuel what he said. And so can you imagine this conversation? What did he tell you? Well, what did he tell you? That's what I've got going on in my mind.
Well, yeah, because Samuel's a kid, and you know that a kid has got to be curious. I mean, a kid's going to ask. There's no sense of propriety there. They're just going to spill it. But, Samuel seems to be reluctant to even go into this conversation. And it isn't until Eli kind of corners him and says, I kind of, my vision of it is, the parents have had a fight and dad's in the backyard at the grill griping about mom. And the little kid goes in and says, well, what, mom says, what did dad say? And it's like,
not going to repeat that.
Yeah. But we all use our own kind of metric to kind of understand these stories.
Yeah. It's just, I was thinking of this conversation. So what God tell you? Do you want to go first?
It's a weird conversation, and it even ends up weird because Eli he accepts it. He says, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Mm-hmm. I mean, God said he's going to kill your sons. He says your grandkids are going to be, have these short lives. They're going to be begging for bread. Wake up. Where's your concern for your family?
Right.
And he doesn't have it.
He just gets very fatalistic about the whole thing.
Yeah. He's a kind of Eeyore character here. So, but the language that's used is similar to something we find in some Akkadian text.
Yeah.
And it's a protocol for prophets, or in the Akkadian, they're diviners. And they say to a prophet will say to the person seeking the word, I will tell and I will not conceal. So the idea that they actually have to say everything that's been told, that they can't hold back the bad so they can get a bigger payoff.
Sure.
Now, does this guarantee that happened?
It's like a legal contract. It's
yeah.
You may not. Results may vary.
Right. So, but Eli totally misses the point, and because he says, whatever God thinks is good, let him do it. But God doesn't do this because he thinks it's good. He does it because it's necessary. Mm-hmm. He does it because it's justice. Mm-hmm. And God does not appreciate it when his leaders don't perform acts of justice. And throughout all of the prophetic words, if you look at what's being said, so often the issue addressed is social justice. Mm-hmm. And, we don't talk about that a lot in the church, at least not in our tradition. And the idea that social justice might actually be something important to God.
Right.
So, but I will move on as soon as I can get to the proper passage.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you look at what the prophets had to say and read some Brueggemann, he'll help you out with it if you don't get it.
Oh, yeah. Brueggemann has been so good in understanding this. And I need to go on record as saying, if you're new to Bible study and you just want a good commentary to kind of go into Samuel, maybe read along, see some more things that I don't have time to bring up, or, feel like we're kind of off track from where I'm going, get the Brueggemann book. It's worth it.
And if you can find a copy of God in Search, In Man We Trust by
right there behind
Brueggemann.
You. I found it.
Don't look
That's
over there.
Mine.
No, don't look. It's not there. It's not the book you're looking for, but you are. In Man We Trust by Walter Brueggemann is really good. He actually does a really good compare and contrast of Saul, David, and Samuel. I
may need to borrow that one again. So
borrow your own book.
Borrow my own book.
Anyway.
Okay.
So I need to read through it again. It's been a while. It just now occurred to me that, hey, that book talks about what we're talking about.
Yeah, that was really good. It was one of my assigned books in seminary that you stole. So
borrowed, it's still here.
Okay, so verse 19. Samuel grew and the Lord was with him, and the ESV is funny. I realized we don't have a problem reading. We're just having a problem reading the ESV. So we may have to go with a smoother translation for that purpose.
No, I have a problem reading aloud.
Yeah, well,
doesn't matter what it is.
Some of this is just the phrasing. But anyway, that's a whole other story. Verse 19, and Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, and the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So, this is setting up the stage for who Samuel is. God let none of his words fall to the ground. So God is making certain that every prophecy Samuel gives, it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And he is doing this because he is proving to the people that Samuel is his prophet.
Right.
And, this is one of the litmus tests for prophets in Deuteronomy. Now, Brueggemann, speaking of, he actually picks up on the subtle way the text is written. And he points out that Israel is receiving Samuel's words, not God's words.
Okay.
The two are connected, but they're not the same. They're not equated with each other. So Samuel still has the capacity to speak for himself, but he's not always in lockstep with God. We're going to see that as we go through Saul.
Right.
Samuel, as we talked about, he seems to be born an old man, a cranky old man.
Right.
And these things that we often overlook in biblical characters are, they don't always have the best attitude. And what I love about Samuel's story is he's always grumbling, he's always complaining, mm-hmm. but he's still obedient. Right. And that's pretty amazing that we can actually grumble and gripe to God, but it's not the end of the world. God will still take care of us and still respond to us as long as we're still acting in a faith and obedience. And so what Brueggemann is saying here, it basically is that Samuel, even whenever he may not be 100% on the same page as God, is that God is still going to uphold Samuel's words to make sure that no one doubts who Samuel is.
Right.
So that actually is very much in keeping with what the rabbis had to say about Samuel. And there is this question of where does Samuel's bad attitude end and God's prophecy begin? And we're going to see that. And that's when we get to Saul.
Some interesting thoughts there.
Yeah, well, it really is. And because you got to remember that the prophets, when they spoke, it was believed that they spoke with the Hadavar. Hadavar is the creative word, that their words actually created new realities. Mm-hmm. And so when Samuel speaks as a prophet, his words make new possibilities. And so God has really endowed him with a spirit that exceeds just delivering a message. Mm-hmm. He's actually getting to participate in the things that God is doing by becoming a creative force. Right. And we see that because he's the kingmaker. He creates the monarchy. Now it's God working through Samuel, but Samuel is the face that we're going to see. Okay. So Samuel's identified as a prophet here. This is Navi, and this is the first male prophet named since Moses.
Right.
We've had 2 female prophets, mm-hmm. but no male prophets during this time. So I think that's really interesting. Matter of fact, there's 19 male prophets named in the Old Testament.
Right.
And there's 5 women. So basically a little over 1/5 of the prophets.
There's 5 women.
5 women.
19 men. Mm-hmm. So a little over 25%.
Yeah. Okay. Whatever. I don't do math. But but that's a significant number of women.
Yeah.
Whenever you realize the ratio like that. So when you've got women being named as prophetess, this is amazing. Yeah, you're going to pull out your calculator.
I've got to figure it out now, like what the... Sorry.
So, okay, while you're figuring that out, the word Navi comes from an Akkadian word.
It's 26.3, et cetera, percent.
Okay. So, yeah. A pretty good showing for the gals.
Yeah.
Just got to say.
The word... Go ahead.
Yeah. The word Navi comes from the Akkadian word Navu. It means to be called by name or to be called to duty. Okay. And in the Akkadian, it's used to describe men who are called to duty by God. So God's tell these men, I need you to do this.
Okay.
And so to be a Navi was to be in service of God.
Sure.
And that's something that we forget, that it's not about telling the future. It's not about predicting things. It's not about finding lost things. These are all things that other prophets would do in other nations. Mm-hmm. It's about telling the people what God had to say. And it doesn't matter whether it happened 3 years ago, today, or 5 years in the future. It's about that word. Mm-hmm. And so the moment we start trying to think of prophets as simply being fortune tellers, we've stopped honoring the position that they've been called to.
Right.
And I think we need to remember that. So verse 21, it said that the Lord had appeared again at Shiloh, and the Lord revealed himself to Samuel by the word of the Lord. Now, again, there's a general resistance to reading this literally. Mm-hmm. And I know we kind of went over this a little bit, but, I don't know why the idea that God can appear to humanity whenever and however he wants becomes a problem to people who believe that God became flesh in Jesus Christ. I don't get that.
Well, I think it's an overemphasis on the idea of not being able to see the face of God and living. That we've heard that over and over. You can't see the face of God and live. But I think Heiser did a kind of a treatment of this mm-hmm. recently in his Exodus series, where it's not so much about the face of God incarnate, as in the mm-hmm. angel of the Lord, but it's you can't not see God in his fullness of glory.
Yeah, which makes total sense.
And so, yeah, I would recommend checking that up. We'll throw it in the show notes. But yeah, it's
that one in Benjamin Sommer, the bodies of God in the Hebrew text or something like that. The bodies of God in the Old Testament. I can't remember the name. Excellent work on God manifesting himself in the Old Testament. And now that is written from a strictly Jewish perspective. So he's not going to draw all the same conclusions that a Christian might.
Right.
But he does present the evidence well. And mm-hmm. a lot of times, and that's something good to kind of point out, when we are talking about Jewish sources, we have to recognize that, basically they stop drawing conclusions with the New Testament. They don't factor any of that in. So we as Christians have to take that work as a foundation mm-hmm. and then being able to discern what actually applies to Christians and moves beyond the Old Testament into this day. And so even like the Jewish Study Bible, I was talking to somebody just a couple of days ago, and they were asking for a good study Bible in the Old Testament, suggested this, and reminded them, hey, this is coming from a different tradition, a different background, and you need to take that into account. But you still get all the good foundational material.
Yeah, you still get a lot of solid work, and even though it doesn't necessarily have the Christian perspective, doesn't mean it's evil.
Right.
It means that this is how the Jewish perspective, that this is how you would look at it if you were reading this before Jesus came around.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we put so much emphasis, and we should, on the person of Jesus. And don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying the significance of Jesus being here.
Right. He was fairly significant.
Yeah. But we forget that he isn't diminished by any of these Old Testament appearances. And it doesn't detract from anything he did during his time, because there isn't the birth narrative. There isn't the growing up and the full-on human experience that Jesus had as Jesus. It's more showing up in the moment that Israel needs that help. Whenever we see this angel of the Lord appear, and here it is with Samuel. He's appearing, and I mentioned this before. 9 times he's before the face of the Lord, and we forget that the end of this verse, where the commentators have many of the commentators I read said, this is not appearance language. They said this is just a voice, and I'm like, what? You were doing so well, and then you fumbled the ball. What's going on here?
Yeah,
and just 10 verses before this, the Bible specifically said that God stood in Samuel's presence. So why this is not a major leap within the text?
Well, it's anthropomorphic language, and God's always present. It's
just so that we can understand. I know. I think there are things in the Bible that are contextualized and brought down so that we can understand that. That's without debate. But then there's just some things that God just lays out there, and we need to accept it. That's what faith is about.
Sure.
And I believe that this is not a mistake. And there's this ongoing dialogue, and as we move through Samuel's life, we're going to see that there's conversations with God. That there aren't just these, these ideas of casting lots, or God is actually giving entire paragraphs for Samuel to tell the people. This doesn't happen if you're trying to use some kind of divination device that was available to people at that time.
Right.
So the fact that God shows up, it's almost necessary for Samuel to be who he is. And, on top of that, we've got in Judges where, the angel of the Lord shows up to Gideon, and he shows up to Manoach and his wife, and, claiming God could not or would not appear, it's inconsistent and it's arbitrary. And I think it forces us to leave the plain reading of the text. So as we move forward, we need to keep in mind all the connections to Moses.
Well, actually, one more thing. Sorry, about the plain reading of the text, which
I knew that was going to set you off.
I'm sorry. No, it's really interesting because it is often I hear that argument of this is just so we can understand it better, but then also the same crowd is also the literalist with Genesis 1 through 3, and their argument is, well, when we stop taking this literal, when we don't read it literally there, at what point do we get to decide, oh, well, when did God stop lying to me about how things went on? Well, it's the same thing here. At what point do you get to choose when God is lying?
Yeah. And that's an interesting debate to have, because we do have this arbitrary idea that we are arbitrators, that we can say when God is being literal and whenever he's being metaphorical. And I think anytime we're not dealing with a psalm, a poetic or wisdom literature reading, then we can pretty much assume God's being literal.
Okay.
So because
like in the narrative stuff.
Yeah, in the narrative stuff, I don't think that we really need to, we don't need to try to find another meaning for it. Now, Genesis 1 through 3, we got a lot of poetry. We have a lot of polemics, and which that's the thing that's going on there. And now, am I negating that that's truth? Absolutely not. Don't misunderstand me. I believe Genesis 1-3 happened. I think maybe we might lack the ability to understand exactly how these things happened.
It was a complicated process.
Right? Life always is. And he created a lot of life.
Yeah. Well, no, what's funny is, we're just to go back to what we were saying earlier about Egypt, and, because we start out with Genesis 1-3, and your take on it is that it's a polemic against the Egyptian gods and the
Canaanite, Mesopotamian.
Yes, all those. But what's really kind of funny is if we go back to that the shepherds were shameful, and then we move to David being king, it's like God's still like poking fun at Egypt in a way.
Constantly.
Like raising up a shepherd as the king.
Yeah. And then, of course, who is Jesus? He's the good shepherd. And I mean, we get into all of that. No, God has got this major sarcastic streak. He's got just this twisted sense of humor that is hilarious. As long as you're not on the receiving end.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. The Egyptians didn't find it very funny now, did they?
Exactly. Well, and, we're getting ready to go into one of your favorite stories about God's sense of humor.
Gosh, yes.
So we'll get that done today. Well, yeah. But going back to Egypt, this is the thing. This story is tied directly to Egypt. And I want to hit some of the high points because, again, got to keep this in tension so that you don't miss anything. You get that true note, if to pull on your guitar analogy. So, this is a time of oppression. Mm-hmm. Phinehas and Hophni, they're acting like the Egyptians. God said, I anointed your family in Egypt. You brought Egypt with you, and you've polluted my house. It's got to go. Mm-hmm. And so we got that connection back. And they're oppressing the nation from within. And you got the Philistines. They're going to be oppressing the nation from without. God's rejected the house of Eli because of that. Mm-hmm. And he's rejecting them specifically because they're preventing people from giving sacrifices. What did Pharaoh refuse to let Moses do? Take the people out to give the sacrifices properly. They're abusing the women. What did Pharaoh do? He kept the girls alive, with the implication that was for sexual service in his harem or whatever. Mm-hmm. Samuel and Moses are God's response to the affliction of his people. Remember, Hannah, she uses those same words that Moses had used at the burning, or God had used to Moses at the burning bush. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. God is silent. God is silent in Egypt. He never speaks while the children of Israel are in Egypt. It's not until Moses goes out into the desert that God actually speaks once again.
Yeah.
The word of the Lord is rare. There is no vision during the time of Samuel until Samuel is ready to receive it.
Right.
So, Moses heard God before a bush that was burning, but not burned up. Now, there's a very interesting connection with Samuel before a lamp that had not yet gone out.
Right.
And so, it again, subtle on the part of the writer. Both places where Moses spoke with God and where Samuel speaks with God are places where God is at home. Mm-hmm. Sinai, that mountain, that holy place. You can go back to our episode on the navel of the Lord.
Navel of the earth.
Yeah, that's it. And then the tent of meeting, where the Ark of the Covenant is, where it's God's throne or God's footstool, depending on how it's being described at that moment. Both Moses and Samuel institute a total regime change, liberating Israel from their oppressors. And when they do that, they also appoint new leadership. And we're going to talk more about that leadership later. Moses is going to commission Bezalel to create the tabernacle, to create the Ark of the Covenant. And Samuel is going to appoint the king, who he's going to take it past the tabernacle and create the temple. Mm-hmm. And so both these places become places where God is glorified, where he's manifest, where the people can come to meet with him. And so the stories do line up very well. Mm-hmm. And if you have that background of Exodus in your head and Moses' story and the things that he accomplished, you begin to see how the two stories begin to illuminate each other. Right. And they fill in the gaps for each other.
Yeah.
And it works both ways.
Okay.
So I think that's a pretty good place for us to kind of start wrapping up. Is there?
That's a lot of information in this episode. So I'll have to think about some of it. I'm sure we'll discuss a lot of this multiple times by the time we're through the book, just because the way it's put together. But I think that's a good spot to end.
And this was an easy chapter.
Oh, I know. That's the fun part. So everyone, I hope you enjoyed it. There's a lot of information. So I'm going to probably listen to this one at least twice. So everyone, thank you for joining us. And I guess if you want to be part of the conversation, if I can remember what we do at the end of this, if you want to be part of the conversation, hit us up on ravencreeksc.com or find us on all the social media at Raven Creek SC. We will be there, mainly Facebook because we're old folk. But anyway, look for us there, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.